Welcome to On the Soul's Terms podcast, a weaving of astrology, Greek mythology, and depth psychology. I'm Chris Skidmore, an astrologer, psychotherapist, and craniosacral therapist living in Ubud, Bali. Today on the show we have Joe Landwehr. Taken from his bio, Joe Landwehr is an astrologer of 50 plus years experience, seeking an eclectic integration of astrology, spiritual psychology, and ancient wisdom teachings. He's the author of 5 books and numerous articles for the Mountain Astrologer and other publications. He's director of the Astropoetic School of Soul Discovery, which offers individualized correspondence courses, webinar classes, and workshops built around the correlation of astrological cycles with actual life experience. He's taught and lectured at ISAR conferences, the Midwest Astrology Conference, and online at International Academy of Astrology. More information about his work can be found at joelandwehr.com, and I'll put a link in the description. We got together to discuss the rich ideas Joe outlines in his most recent book, Astrology in the Era of Uncertainty, an astropoetic exploration of psyche and cosmos. In this conversation, Joe generously shares the gems of his lifetime of astrological research. We ask the question, what is astrology? It's a broad and unanswerable question, but we find some good ways to approach it, including the idea from Terrence McKenna that it is a trans-linguistic language. We then get into the mythopoetic and magical roots of astrology and discuss what it feels like in a consultation when the chart truly comes to life. In this way, astrology and its symbols encourage a form of what Jung called Participation Mystique, a way to see ourselves as embedded within an alive and soulful world. We end our discussion at the same place Joe ends his book, with Hestia, the first of the Olympians and the goddess of the eternal flame of the hearth, within ourselves, within the home, within the earth, and ultimately within the cosmos. I hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I did. Okay, welcome back to On the Soul's Terms podcast, and I'm joined by a guest today, Joe Landwehr. Joe, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me on it.
Yeah. Joe actually sent me his book, which is a beautiful, I especially love the illustrations, by the way, Joe. It's a very poignant title, Astrology in the Era of Uncertainty. And underneath that, it has written an astropoetic exploration of psyche and cosmos. So even just the title is right down my alley and right down the alley of On the Soul's Terms podcast. So thank you, Joe, for reaching out. Joe actually sent me this book in the mail, which has gone to a lot of places already. It went to my home in Australia and then found its way up to me in Bali. And I've been just really enjoying devouring sections of it and getting deeper into, what sounds like a 50-year devotional practice by the seams of things to astrology. So thank you firstly for reaching out. Thank you also for sending me the book. It's really in alignment with
Sure.
how I think about astrology. And yeah, I mean, it feels like we've got so many pathways we could take, but tell me about you and your, what it's been like to have 50 years embedded within astrology and, what that journey is for you. I know that's a broad question, but it'll get more detailed.
Yeah, I'll try to boil that down to a manageable bite-sized chunk rather than tell you the entire story.
Yes, maybe a few
But
bites.
I discovered astrology about 50 years ago. And like most astrologers, I had a reading that sort of blew me away because I just couldn't understand how a complete stranger could have so much insight into my life.
Yeah.
And I had to know his secret, So after the reading was over, I said, well, if I wanted to explore this a little bit, what would you suggest? And so he turned me on to Dane Rudger, and then through Rudger I discovered Mark Edmund Jones, and then also this was back in the early 70s, and there were lots of emerging psychological astrologers, people like Stephen Arroyo and Liz Green, and Noel Till was also an interesting early influence. And so anyway, I just kept going with it. And then at a certain point, I was also studying Kundalini yoga, and I was living in an ashram in Southern California, and just started, and also getting my master's degree in marriage, family, and child counseling, studying Western psychology.
Wow.
So I just naturally started weaving together astrology with Western psychology and a little bit of yogic philosophy. And I was also doing readings for everybody that came through the center. We had a teachers training center, and taught local classes at the colleges, and just about everybody that came through there got a reading from me. That was sort of my astrological apprenticeship. And then I started a correspondence course. I had, at a certain point, I realized I'd rather teach than simply do readings for people. I'd rather teach them the language so that they could explore their own charts. So I did that for probably about a decade, and I had about a couple dozen students at the peak of that period. I had a couple dozen students, and I was working with each student individually, like creating each lesson from scratch, and so it was very labor intensive. But I loved it because I learned so much. I learned more from doing that than from doing readings. And then the third phase of my career, I just decided, okay, I need to write some of this down. And so I actually had to take a sabbatical from my correspondence course because I just had too many things going on, not just astrological, but, life, So I had to let go of a lot of stuff in order to write my first book, which I did in 2001. And then this will be my sixth book. So, but I continue to, I continue to teach, although I haven't done anything much since the pandemic. And I continue to do, clients occasionally, not as many as I used to.
Right. Yeah.
I'm also focused on the writing now.
Yeah. That's interesting. A couple of things. You referenced the teaching the language of astrology, and that's I feel like a good descriptor for what it is, that it's a language, and that it is a way to convey things that maybe ordinary language can't really get to or can't really access. I also like this image because it's very similar to my own. I like that kind of like synchronicity between our paths, because when I first started doing astrology, I was also working in a yoga studio here in Bali. That's where I got started. And there was a yoga teacher training, and then everybody that came to the training came to me for either craniosacral therapy or astrology. So then 80 people suddenly came through the door, and that sort of like getting up your reps, getting up your reps of
similar
like
path,
very right. Similar, and also of course, I'm a psychotherapist and trained in that world too. The psychological frameworks but yeah, the getting I could relate to kind of like what happens when you start to get the reps going. You start to see a lot of charts, and then it starts to really hum, and you start to look at those charts like they're those 3D artwork, right? Like it suddenly comes to life, and you're seeing things, you're seeing connections that are in a whole different sort of frequency. And so what I'm always interested in, because I didn't necessarily come into astrology, like the angle that I came into astrology was actually more fascinated in mysticism, where I was in the UK and I met a lot of, people that I would consider to be witches, actually, kind of like people operating with this other frequency of knowing. That's how I came into, eventually led me to astrology. So to me, astrology was always fit super well into the mysticism. But then as the further I got to it, it was like, oh no, this is a science, I guess. And you talk about this in the book of like the history of astrology and where it does actually fit and where it doesn't fit and how it struggles to fit. And it's something that has such rich, deep knowing, as you said, you know, that first reading that you get. I remember also my first experiences of the accuracy of this art form being so striking. But then also having to ask the question, like, if this is so accurate and this is such a deep way of knowing, why is it not practiced and used? What gets in the way of it being sort of central to our understanding of, as you say, reality? So I wonder if we can, elaborate on perhaps even just down to the basics of like what astrology is, and in your experience and your opinion and your felt sense, what is this thing that we tool around with?
Yeah, it's a very, very deep question, and I don't know that there's any one definitive answer for it. But I think that I agree with you that the astrology is a language, and it's a language rooted in symbolism, and it was developed by the Greeks, the Hellenistic Greeks, as a logical system, which was meant to be understood by the analytical mind. But I think that really it's more than that, because in order to really understand, let's say, what a birth chart is trying to tell you, you have to connect with a person whose chart you're reading, number one, and you have to have your emotional faculties operating. You have to notice visual cues. You have to sense sort of micro movements that are difficult to put into words. You start to develop an intuitive sense of what's going on that goes beyond the mere understanding of the symbolism. And how that actually works is a bit of a mystery, but anybody that's done it for a period of time knows that, like you'd mentioned, you're looking at the chart and all of a sudden it becomes a three-dimensional thing rather than just a flat two-plane diagram. Well, as I point out in the beginning of my book, it's not unlikely to assume that astrology developed as what Terrence McKenna called a trans-linguistic language, which means that it also had a visual component, so that you're speaking words, but at the same time you're visualizing sort of the reality behind those words. And at the same time you're calling it into being. There's no separation between you and the reality that you're trying to map to the birth chart, whether that be a person or a question or a nation state or whatever it is you're trying to understand. There's an ever-evolving field of information that takes place on multiple levels. And so as you begin to work with the symbolism, it opens up in that way. And so now it's like when I first started, of course, like most astrologers, I prepare for hours for a reading, and then I would inevitably discover that, well, what happened in the reading was something totally other than what I had planned. And so over time, I just learned to be more spontaneous in the moment with whatever it was I was doing. And I learned to trust myself, so that, stuff would come out of my mouth and I'd have no idea where that's coming from, but I'm interacting with the person, with the chart in front of me, and it's evoking some kind of understanding for me that is not just rooted in my understanding of astrology. It goes deeper than that.
Yeah, it's almost.
So I don't know if that answers your question, but
Yeah, well, no, it does. I mean, it raises questions off the question, which is great. That's what I want to do.
yeah,
But yeah, it as you were talking there, I got an image of. I've had this image before, but it really came through strong there. Of, when you're like cracking a safe. I mean, not like that you are, not like you're actually a thief, but
yeah.
maybe we are. Maybe we're stealing from the gods.
My other life, I was a,
Yeah,
a safe cracker. Yeah.
But it feels like that sometimes, and it gets more subtle you just, as you're kind of clicking the chart around, and then suddenly something opens and you're no longer looking at these kind of like symbols on a page. I think that's kind of it. You're no longer, you're in that, and you mention it. It's a section in your book that I really enjoyed about Participation Mystique, which is a Jungian sort of phrase, or Jung really lent into that, where suddenly rather than it being, here's me, here's the client, here's the chart, there's three separate things happening here. The symbols are telling me what the thing is and, all this kind of stuff. It suddenly, I don't know how to describe it fully, but it's almost like everything gets animated. And then I feel myself also drawn into the field of this person's life and experience and way of seeing the world, and ultimately deeply subjective experience. We sort of lose track of any objective, or the objective reality becomes kind of softened or something. And then as we're going into symbol, the symbols start to speak. And that's why over the last few years really got diving deeper into the myths behind the symbols, because then whole stories are there and those stories are dreamlike. And so it's almost like the dreaming mind enters the field, and then we've slipped into it. I can only say it that way, really. We've slipped into another dimension. And, but in that dimension, it's like all this symbolic stuff, all this kind of way of communicating, all this. I love the trans-linguistic. Everything is just kind of crisply there. And then when the reading ends, it's also like a closing down of that world and a coming back to this everyday reality. And I think that's kind of that something occurs, and then. So it seems to me like, as I'm speaking about it, I'm thinking about what I'm saying. It's like a ritual space, something like that. To me, this is the thing we might be engaging in, something like a ritual to enter some other place.
Creating a ritual space with another person and entering into a relationship with that person. You're not. I mean, when you first start learning astrology, there's this, and this is at least what I felt, and I know this is probably a fairly common experience. You feel an internal pressure to provide this person with information. You're the expert, and they're there to receive what you have to offer. But at a certain point, you realize, well, no, I can't do that unless I actually have a conversation with this person, and so there's an exchange. There's a dialogue, and you can't predict ahead of time where that's going to go, because you're only one part of it.
Yeah.
The other person is a part of it, and also the cosmos is a part of it. This is the ritual space. You're entering an agreement to, okay, we're going to invite in a deeper understanding of whatever it is that we're exploring here. That's sort of the unspoken agreement when you're doing a reading with somebody, and you can even amplify that by saying something like that to set up the ritual space. But the more you are aware of entering that space with another person, the more access you have to cosmic intelligence, sacred intelligence, the information that is not limited to what you know. You can explore what you don't know.
Yeah.
And I do think that the stories enter into it. You mentioned the myths. Well, the myths are still very much alive in our lives. They're not. We are living various bits and pieces of those mythical stories in present time. And as you are talking with somebody about their chart and about their life and what's meaningful to them, those stories emerge, and then you can see those stories reflected in the chart. You can hear what part of the chart they're talking about in their language. And you can use the chart as a sort of a loosely held map to the possibility of steering the conversation into a more interesting place.
Yeah.
But you don't want to get caught up in controlling that either, because it's going to surprise you where it wants to go, not necessarily going to be where you expect it to go.
I really love that as far as how you're describing that, because that's really well articulated. That's what I got from reading your book as well, articulating some of my thoughts, sort of as you're further down the track than me, and being able to sort of read the thoughts that you've been working on for so long. But this moment where, and it's funny because that would be some of the criticism of astrology, some of this stuff, right? Like that we read body language, that we read response, that we hear what the person's talking about, then take it to the chart, rather than the chart sort of being this pure wisdom, knowing that we're meant to give over to the other person. It never really occurred to me that way. To me, the person talks and they talk about elements of the chart, and then I'm hearing, and then the more that I'm hearing them talk about that, the more they talk about it, which is an interesting phenomenon too, right? Like then everything they're saying is according to this, maybe, I don't know, Venus in Taurus in the 10th or something. And then I just keep hearing it again and again. And then I bring in the symbol. But then they've got this rich thing that they've just said that then you attach to the symbol, that you're like, and there's probably many more expressions of this as well. That always feels to me like we've brought the chart to life. And the other way around, which is, especially when I was first learning, like for those out there who are or are not astrologers, I don't know, but learning astrology is hard. There's so many things that you need to learn, so many elements that you need to learn, and you kind of have to learn it to a certain extent by rote in order to get the system at the beginning, I think, because otherwise you'll miss certain things. So you have to go through all 12 of the signs, all of the planets, all of the houses, all of the aspects, and you just kind of like one after the other getting those parts. So then when you go into your early readings, as you say, way over prepared, as opposed to today where they'd just be kind of like a taking in and then it's going to the person. But back then I remember just like all the notes I'd be scribbling about this chart. And then there's a danger that you want to impose your chart because you're trying to do your thing, your new thing that you've just learned, and you want to kind of like dazzle and razzle dazzle with it, or do you look at this so that I know. And then, but then it can become like astrology can then become this sticky thing, like almost like a subtle or not so subtle insistence that you be this chart. And I love being able to ease that, later on. It's been, I don't know, maybe 15 or 20 years now that I've been in these symbols. So I've been able to rest back from it and not insist on this person behaving like this chart, rather than going the other way around and learning about the person and then using the chart to be like, hey, this could be helpful for these things that keep coming up, or these patterns that keep going around, and maybe taking that to, seeing that this is maybe a shadow component of that, but you could transform it into this with enough awareness of it, or something like that, where, the chart then becomes like it's following us along. Like Jason Holly once said, it's the wise elder in the room. I like that framing. That will sort of step in sometimes, and then not holding on so tightly to those symbols and what they must mean and what they have to mean. And you have to you're kind of trying to get this thing across, which doesn't really seem to work. Trying to push your thing across to the other person. And there's kind of a danger in that too, right?
Well, yeah, there is. And I think it's also a phase that we all have to go through. You know, as you said, you know, when you first learn astrology, you're learning it pretty much by rote. But, you know, the parallel is learning a language. You know, you learn the vocabulary, you learn the grammar and the syntax, and even then it's still a while before you can actually speak the language and have a conversation in using the language. You know, you can parrot back the phrases from your, well, back in the day it was the ALM tapes where you know, hello, pasi bandukas, you know, or whatever, and you know that, but you don't know how to take those words and put them in a different context and make a different sentence out of them. So that's kind of where we're stuck, you know, not stuck, but we have to go through that somehow, you know. And then you know, and so when you finally get it, then you go through the dogmatic phase where you're insisting that, okay, this is what that means. But, you know, as Richard Tarnas so eloquently pointed out, you know, astrology is multidimensional and multivalent. It can mean, and we're never going to exhaust the possibilities for what a given astrological signature means. You know, it's not going to happen in this lifetime, you know, or whatever. But so after a while you learn, like you say, you know, the other person will start to translate the chart into their language. You know, so you hear them say, you know, I had my Venus in Taurus, and you know, I you know, in my 10th house, and I was supposed to be out there, you know, busting my butt to create a career, but I felt like, you know, Ferdinand the Bull. All I really wanted to do was lay in the field and watch the flowers grow. You know, okay, well there you have that person's metaphor for what that is for them, and you go with that. So, wow, isn't that interesting? You know? I couldn't have come up with that.
Exactly.
That's their story. You know, so it's much richer when you're able to make that transition.
Yeah, and you know, it's interesting because then you learn this language, you spend all the time learning it, and then there aren't that many people to speak it with, and then the person that you are speaking it to doesn't know your language. So actually, while you've been talking just now, I was thinking, you know, one of my trainings in astrology, I believe, was that I taught kindergarten kids in Taiwan, and they didn't, you know, we'd start when they're only 3 years old. I'm not allowed to use any Chinese, not that I know much, but I have to enter with English, and then they have to respond in English. And so what that helped me to do was to use simple words to convey more and more complex things, right? So you'd have to, I think part of that role where I had 20 kids in the room, you know, so sometime there was a group that I took for 3 years from the ages of 3 to 6 years old. Sort of 20 of them traveled with me 5 days a week for 3 years, right? Like we got so close, but then you realize that because you're sort of forced to be out of their natal language, you are using more body language, more sort of subtle nuance. You're getting a sense of where they're at. Things don't need to be communicated. So when I was just reflecting there about the language, like, you know, sometimes parts of your life can feel like they're not on track. Like this is not the life, and then eventually I'll get round to the calling. But actually, if you look at life from a different angle, those chunks of time, you know, like my 5 years teaching English, that feels like it was some kind of a side quest that I was on, was actually very valuable for being able to sit with someone in a language that they don't know, but complex concepts are there, and help sort of as quickly as possible get into it, because you can't teach the language in a session, obviously. And oftentimes with astrology, people would still come for just the one session or just every now and again. And again, you're trying to get that you would love to be able to sort of like pass over the language, but you realize you spent like 5 years learning that language before you could really get fluent or even begin fluency in it.
Yeah. Well, here's the thing that I would say. I mean, doing a reading for somebody is almost the opposite of your experience, because you're not wanting to speak astrology to that person.
Yeah.
You're wanting to speak English, and eventually you want to be able to be talking about the chart in language that's native to them.
Yeah, nice.
Everybody has their own. Aside from everybody speaking English, we all have our own, idiosyncratic ways of saying things or understanding things, or metaphors that we, pet metaphors that we trot out every now and then. So it's understanding what those are for the other person. And also, like you said, you learned how to read the body language of these students that were speaking a different language. I mean, that's a part of it too. You're just paying attention. Really, I mean, when you come down to the essence of what a good astrological reading is, it's not that different than a good psychotherapy session, in that you're paying quality attention to the person that you're with, and your only agenda is to help them get clarity about whatever it is they're bringing to the session. And so you're actually doing more listening than speaking, at least initially. And then as you begin to see their end of the conversation reflected in the birth chart, you can ask them questions that are going to go more deeply into the heart of the matter, because you have the map in front of you.
Yeah.
And you're not going to frame those questions in astrological language. You're just going to steer the conversation a little bit this way, a little bit that way, because you can see what they're talking about.
Yeah.
And also, you mentioned, the idea that that person might be struggling with something. I mean, we're all struggling with something, right? But you can see that reflected in the birth chart, and you also understand that there are other ways of expressing and manifesting that same energy. So you can, you can make suggestions, but more important than that is the understanding that how this birth chart is actually being lived is a matter of consciousness, the consciousness that this person brings to their life, and as consciousness evolves, which hopefully it will. I mean, I think that's really why we're all here. You learn and you grow, and then the chart starts to reveal itself in a different way. Same symbolism, but
at
a different level of consciousness. So in part, I think if you're working with somebody over any length of time, this is the story that you want to get. Where have you been with this particular piece of your chart? Where are you now, and where can you go? I mean, there's a whole evolutionary trajectory that is all you can only really know through the story. Without the story, it's just speculation.
Yeah.
So you want to get the story. I mean, this is why I've moved away from doing one-off readings. Excuse me. I try to encourage people to do a series of sessions.
Yeah, because you can just sort of enter. Yeah, me too. And that has been the benefit of qualifying into psychotherapy, so that's more kind of like an understood thing that we can do. But I actually think astrology, this is sort of part of the point here. If we move beyond this one-to-one component, like astrology is obviously much more than that too, right? Like it can contain the one-to-one. That's obviously a great use for it. But there's so many other sort of avenues for it, or other things that astrology kind of talks about and motions towards, I suppose. But as you say, yeah, like there's a sense that you go to an astrologer for a reading, then boom, there's your reading, and then you kind of go on something else. And I think in the type of astrology we're talking about, there's a real unfolding, because the way that the chart is behaving in this given moment is going to change over time, and people need to be able to feel the dynamism of their chart and how things are changing and things are progressing, regressing. Often, sometimes a part of the chart will really come alive and give a completely different, manifestation of itself, but also it can regress back. And so then you can get the sense of it being very much alive and moving through time. And as the timeless kind of like enters the time bound, which is another way to see what we're doing with astrology, the timelessness of it, because all these old myths that are embedded in it and all these symbols and dream images are timeless. They don't behave according to our time-bound rules. They start to come alive and also drift around, and start to move around. And I hear you on, it'd be nice if it was more understood within going to see astrologers that you would go to see for maybe several sessions, maybe not necessarily ongoing work, but you could do that too, I mean, it's fascinating. I've worked with one of my clients for quite a few years now, and it's so great that the astrological chart will come back in and out, and then every time it comes back in, it's like we really understand it on a different level. And sometimes like it'll click where a symbol, a dream, and a myth and a astrological symbol will all sort of come together, and there'll be this. It almost feels like 6 months worth of work will suddenly happen in 10 minutes in those times, right? The clicking and the way that everything kind of aligns suddenly. We get to really see what's going on in that symbol.
Well, that's opening up to that timeless space.
Yeah.
That you were talking about a minute ago. And I think that's really the deeper possibility with astrology is going into that place, where the myths are aligned with your personal stories, would align with your dreams. There's all these layers of synchronicity that are happening pretty much all the time, although we're not aware of it all the time. And, if you can create a little bit of that space in your reading with somebody, then you can also introduce people to the idea that, you can take this back into your life and work with it. The same space that we were able to create here together, you can actually create when you go back home and have a conversation, around a simple image, a simple image that comes out of the reading that you can take with you and use as a point of meditation to open back to this time and space and see what emerges. I mean, it's I think you were talking earlier about the astrology. You're relating to astrology from the mystical tradition, which is where it was actually a spiritual practice. Is my sense of it. You had to have you had to be in a certain place of alignment in order to actually understand what the gods were saying, through their movement through the sky. It was a little bit more direct experience in what I call the mystical era than it is just reading symbols on a piece of paper. It's opening to that timeless space, but in the here and now. This is happening now, and you could see the helical rising of Venus or the setting of Mercury or whatever. And you understood that this was a moment, a moment in which the gods were speaking, and you felt that, because you were in that place of alignment. You got to be in good health. You got to, you got to work on your own issues so that you have a certain emotional clarity. You have to, develop a sense of reverence, a sense of the spiritual, of being connected to the mysteries, and go into it with a real sense of it's receptivity, clarity of intention and receptivity, and then it all becomes available. It's not instantaneously. This is a practice, but it is possible to go there, and it is possible to teach your clients how to go there with you.
Yeah.
And this is increasingly where I want to go with this.
Yeah. Yeah, like each symbol is its own dream door that can open up into that other world, that other way of knowing. And, for me, just to touch into that every now and again helps me immensely with my time-bound life, my sort of chronological, chronological life that is going from one causal moment to another effect. And then suddenly this way that it opens up into, I guess, what Jung would call the synchronous, or the, again, participation mystique. But you had a section in your book where you mentioned Aleister Crowley, and I was fascinated to take some of that in of
you are a active participant in the cosmic melodrama, and you can approach that as a spiritual exercise, a spiritual practice, that you're going to bring as much presence, much awareness into everything that you do that you possibly can. And your birth chart could be a sort of a template for that. Certainly a timing, an exquisite timing device, and also a mapping device to the archetypal dimensions. But eventually you want to get out of all of that head stuff and just understand that this is you're participating in the cosmic drama. That's the most succinct way I can put it. And when you do that, you're making yourself available to a deeper level of information coming directly through the cosmos. And I think this was Aleister Crowley's interest, and I think this was, the interest of a lot of people in what would be considered, the magical tradition, is having that sense of participation. You're creating a sacred space. You're stepping into that space as an active participant, and you're trying to align yourself with the primal cosmic forces at play. That's really the essence of magic, as I understand it. And of course, that it's a tricky dance, because you can't do it really. You can't do it well from a place of ego. You can't do it from a place of I am the master of the universe, and now I am creating. Any of that shit gets just it distorts and perverts the whole experience, And as we all know, there's a history, but just to create the opening, to create the and to step into it, and be willing, to actually be an agent of the divine, which is kind of, sounds like a quaint way of putting things in this era. But I'm also a mystic by temperament. So I understand that the gods and goddesses are living in me, and I want to be a gracious host to them. I guess is really how I would put it.
Yeah.
And the deeper purpose of astrology is it can be showing us how to do that.
Yeah. Well, I'm interested in the ancient traditions like mystery cults and how, for instance, like the Eleusinian mysteries, everybody was sworn to secrecy, and most of the names that we know from ancient Greece went through it, but nobody talked about it. Even though they were writers and teachers and philosophers, that was a sacred thing that you couldn't talk about. Right. And I think there's an element of that, right, of why is that? And in the modern day of a more pessimistic view on or outlook on something like that, it's like, because they, didn't want to share, or or it was nothing. It was, something like this, these arguments. But actually, I can really understand why the mystery cults would be like, the most important thing would be to be sworn to secrecy, so that only the initiates that have actually gone through the process that the psyche needs to go through to be able to not do those things of the ego, not become the master of the universe, not use it as a destructive trickster tool, going through that first before you can get to the gold there, because then when you use the gold, you'll use it well, versus using it because it could also be used to just, all sorts of ways that you could use magic like that, as we see. So that I find is interesting, as far as, because we've lost so many of those ways of approaching reality, then we've lost a lot of those, or most of the mystery cults, although I have no doubt, the things I've seen in my life, these things are still out there. They're just maybe not, they don't have a light on them. But because we've generally lost that way of approaching reality, but the magic still wants to come back through, of course, because it has its own desire to actually, I think, to help the humans, but then it comes through and gets distorted because there aren't those really strict, like the 9 days. I can only really imagine the 9 days of the Eleusinian mysteries and what you actually would go through, and that it was held by priests and priestesses, and that was held in sacred spaces, and that each person would go through what they needed to go through, and then come back after facing whatever it is that they faced with a new vitality and a new awareness and a new intelligence, that they could come back to their life with, and a new freedom from whatever it is they were connected to down there. And I wonder about that with the, how much to reveal, how much do we play sort of Prometheus and stealing fire to deliver it down to the humans, and how much that is kind of like the ultimate inflation myth in its own way. I don't know.
Yeah, I think there's a lot that goes into that. Part of it is what you talked about. The mystery traditions, where they understood that they did understand they were playing with fire,
Yeah.
And that there had to be a certain container for that, a certain way of maintaining the purity of the teachings, and also to make sure that the people that went through it were, they did get to the gold, and to get to the place where they really understood what they were doing and how to work well with it before they were released. And and in a certain kind of ironic way, you get to that point, and it's like, well, what is there to talk about? You want to live your life from that place.
Yeah.
And besides, it's how easy is it to put into language. You put it into language, and somebody, it's like the telephone game. You speak, your experience as clearly as you possibly can. The next person distorts a little bit. Next person distorts it more, and by the time it gets to the end of the line, well, guess what? It's nothing like it was at the beginning, and it becomes, somewhere along the line, it becomes a religion.
Yeah.
And it becomes a religion that's wrapped in this political organization that is interested in power and doesn't really understand the original experience. And especially now, and in the age that we live in, everything becomes a meme. It's put up on Facebook and goes through the social media thing, and before you know it, it's gone. Whatever it was, it's gone. It's not any resemblance to the original experience. This is a precious experience that we're talking about, and you want to preserve that. You want to honor that. You want to hold that in sacred space.
I'm just reflecting on what you said there. Before you know it, it's gone. And that feels like, and I want to get to that actually, because the title of your book is Astrology in the Era of Uncertainty. And it feels like we're just wandering into that field. And I'd love to, because these words, when I first saw the cover of your book, and, I like a title that makes me think and that makes me wonder and makes me contemplate and see things from a different angle, like Hermes, where he turns that tortoise upside down and sees music in it, kind of thing, right? Like turning it upside down. And
Yeah.
the era of uncertainty. Can you elaborate for me on that? And what do you see as that era? And what are you getting at there?
Yeah. There's actually at least, I would say, two levels of meaning to that word. The first level was what I was really talking about was when science itself entered the quantum era, and you had, and all of a sudden, science, which is built on objective certainty, this is its claim to fame, right? All of a sudden can't make that claim anymore, because all we can really talk about as in the context of science is probability. Something is probably true to a certain extent, and to what extent defines whether or not we consider it to be truth, So this is a far cry from being able to measure things and then say with some authority that this is true, this is what is real. We can't do that anymore. Science can't do that anymore. And you start talking about cutting edge science, where people, theoretical physicists discussing string theory, or scientists beginning to dabble in consciousness studies. What is consciousness? Is it just a epiphenomenon of the brain, or is there more to it than that? And that's a really interesting discussion, by the way, because not all scientists are, they're beginning to realize that, that it's not just, you can't just speak about a physical model of a brain processing information. So anyway, the long story short is that all the tools that used to define what science is no longer work in the way that scientists expect them to work. There's a lot of uncertainty about what you can say with any kind of scientific accuracy, or as a statement of definitive fact. It's become increasingly difficult to do that. So that's the first level of uncertainty.
Yeah.
And of course, the more obvious one that most people probably latch onto before they read the book is the sense that we live in uncertain times, when life itself is increasingly uncertain. And of course, that's from our perspective. I mean, I'm sure that, if you were growing, if you were in the 14th century and you were going through the bubonic plague, I'm sure you would consider that to be an era of uncertainty. Or if you were being invaded by Genghis Khan, history is always filled with uncertainty. But I also think that, in living in the postmodern era, we don't have many reliable sources of authority, people that we could look to for definitive answers about anything, And of course, all of this is compounded when you start talking about artificial intelligence, and you start talking about the deliberate agenda that some people have to spread mis and disinformation. So it's increasingly difficult to know what is real, what is true, what is actually happening. And, from my way of looking at it, this creates more of an opening for astrologers who are willing to talk about astrology as a language of gnosis, let's say, where you can understand reality from your own direct connection to the sacred intelligence coming through this symbolism, if you're able to open to it in a clear-minded, open-hearted way. So that's the opening. Not just for astrologers. I think there's a hunger everywhere on the planet. People want to know. They want to know what's true, what's real, how to navigate this minefield of, false information, of uncertainty, just life, which is, increasingly uncertain in the face of, climate change and species extinction. And I mean, it's overwhelming sometimes, and, wars and genocides and all the rest of it. I mean, my sister is one of the most reliable, most stable people I know, but she lives on the Gulf Coast in Florida, and she just experienced 2 hurricanes back to back. Helene and I forget the other name. Sorry, but anyway, two hurricanes back to back, and it's like all of a sudden, she's talking about, well, okay, now what do I do? Where do I stay here in her condo on the beach, or do I think about moving somewhere else, or how do I navigate this intensified, increased uncertainty? And I think each in our own way, we're all in that place.
Yeah. Yeah, there's so much that you've touched on there, and I guess how to navigate the information of this age, especially with the ramping up of AI and deepfake things. So, somebody could now and it's going to become increasingly so that there can be a video out there that is just straight up somebody saying something. This has already happened, right? There's already been some controversy over this, and that tech's only going to get better. So you can just decide that this person said this and then make the whole scene happen. So, and that's what my first sort of thought when I was contemplating what is Pluto in Aquarius going to be about. My first sort of sense of that is the necessity to develop what I might call a bit more of a shamanic knowing, like the Plutonian deeper knowing that goes along with the informational upper world knowing. Because I was thinking about the 2 abductions. It's something I've talked about a bit on the podcast, the abduction of Persephone into the underworld, but also the abduction through the Aquarian myth of Ganymede into the upper world, who becomes the cupbearer of the gods. In the Homeric hymn to Aphrodite, he's taken up by Zeus and the eagle, or sometimes this whirlwind sort of thing, taken up to the upper world and stuck up there. And Persephone's taken down to the underworld and stuck down there. I was sort of looking at those 2 images of abductions, and obviously that's a massive splitting off because it's completely different realms. The Mount Olympian world and the underworld are, they don't meet. So it's not exactly the easiest kind of thing, but it's like, how do we develop what Saffron Rossi, who you talked about in the book, has been on the show as well, the archetypal eye. I like this terminology, because without the archetypal eye, or without developing that other eye, depending on which eye we have, we become like the Cyclops, which is how I started this season of the show, actually talking about the image of the Cyclops and then the Hecatoncres as well, with the 100 hands. We're either doing a million things or we're just like focused just straight down. This is how I see reality, and these technologies have coaxed us more and more into our own echo chambers. And so we become these Cyclopses fighting other Cyclopses. That's a recipe for destruction and disaster right there, And so there's never really this, and this is why I think it becomes important to talk about the mythopoetic roots of astrology, symbolic language, magic, other ways of so it's because that's, to me, what I really resonated with in your book is like, this isn't just about like, here's a way for someone to understand themselves, because that's what astrology is usually used for now. It's actually for all of us to understand reality, to see our own biases as set forth in the chart, but also our own gifts as set forth in the chart, and our own subjective view of what is essentially an intersubjective reality, rather than this Babel Tower of trying to get to the objective, or the Tower of Babel, trying to climb up and get to this objective place that seems to me to be never really offering itself. I'm really interested in truth. I think that the concept of truth needs to come back and be reworked, and because I don't like the idea that we're in post-truth. I know we're postmodern and all that, but when I was reading Sophocles' play on Oedipus the king, and there's Tiresias, the blind seer, and Tiresias is in this scene with Oedipus, and he's telling him straight out, you know, the one who killed this man and married Jocasta, that's you. You married your mother and you killed your father. And obviously Oedipus is taking this information in, and it seems so false to him, and he's so angry about it. He's getting really worked up. And he begins to threaten Tiresias, and he says, like, how do you expect to escape? And Tiresias answers back, I have escaped because I'm with the truth. And I love that. I love that exchange. It's like, it hit me really deeply of, here's this blind seer with no eyes, right?
Yeah.
Who's able to access the seeing of the mind of Zeus. And because he's so aligned with truth, he is free. He is free in that sense. So yeah, that image just came forward.
Well, here's, I mean, you know, I'm not as well versed with all this mythology as you are, but if I'm not mistaken, wasn't Tiresias the one who also became a woman for a while?
Yeah,
He
7
was both
years.
man
Yeah, he had 7 years
woman.
as a woman. Yeah, that's right.
So, to me, this is part of what allows someone to see, because
interesting.
you have to be able to maintain a focus, clarity of focus, a clarity of intent, which is perhaps, you know, the archetypal masculine point of it. I mean, you know, the Cyclops, in a sense, is the hyper masculine one-pointed focus, and everything on the periphery is, you know, irrelevant. Whereas the feminine is, no, everything, we're in relationship to all of it, and there's a lot happening on the periphery that's really essential to knowing the truth, if there is such a thing. And then, so you have to maintain both of these at the same time: your focus, your clarity of intent, and your openness, your receptivity to whatever is happening all around you, and your relational connections with everything that happens all around you. So the fact that Tiresias had an apprenticeship as a woman and went through this, you know, presumably, I mean, I'm sure they don't spell it out in the myth, but this was his initiation into the art of seeing, you know. The other part of it is that, okay, he's blind, so he can't actually, his knowing, well, may or may not, but I'm guessing it does for him, come from a deeper place. It's not dependent on sense perception, but at the same time, there's probably, you know, I can only imagine this. I've never been blind, so I don't really know, but sort of an extrasensory perception of things, you know. It's like people, I do know that people lose their sight and they develop, you know, their other senses become heightened, you know, like they'll develop more auditory range, they'll develop a more tactile sense of things, their sense of smell becomes more acute. So it's almost like, you know, the barrier between inner and outer sort of also collapses. You know, it's like the idea that we're this person living in this world. Well, is that actually the case, or are we? There's other words fail, but it's like, are we not both? You know, are we not sort of like the interface between whatever lives in here, consciousness, and whatever might be out there to encounter that we could be in a relationship to? The seer is at that interface, you know, between the inner and the outer. There's no, this is participation mystique. The barrier, in a sense, dissolves, and it becomes a more direct way of knowing that uses both hemispheres of the brain, the masculine, the feminine. Everything is engaged.
Yeah, I love where you're taking Tiresias, because, you know, he sees these two snakes. This is how he turns into a woman in the first place. He sees these two snakes entangled, which we know those two snakes, symbolically from the caduceus and from maybe Kundalini and this left, right, and this intertwining the DNA strands, even this kind of thing. He sees them in a lake, so they're in the water and they're entangled in each other, and something about seeing them transforms him immediately into a woman, which also has echoes of the Hermaphrodite myth, where Hermaphroditus, the child of Hermes and Aphrodite, also gets entangled in another human and becomes both things. But then just seeing these snakes, I mean, this is the vivid, dreamlike imagery of the Greek myths that I keep coming back to, because once I see them as dreams and not systems of oppression or whatever they get caught up in these days, I just see them as dreams. And what a dream that is, that he turns into a woman. He has 7 years as a woman, sees the same two snakes in the same lake, entangled in each other again, and turns into a man. And so then when Zeus and Hera are trying to understand between each other, their question is who enjoys sex more. This is also the playfulness of the Greeks, I think. And because it's just, Zeus is saying definitely women, Hera's saying definitely men. So they're in this argument back and forth. and none of them. And so Hera has the concept. Oh no, Zeus has the idea. Well, why don't we ask Tiresias? He's been both. Why don't we go ask him?
Yeah.
And because his answer is favorable to Zeus, because he says women enjoy it more, then Hera blinds him because he gave the wrong answer. And that's why Zeus then feels bad about that but can't undo that, so he gives him second sight in order to make up for his loss of his eyes. So this is the sort of like fantastic way. Then his first prophecy is to Narcissus, and he tells him he'll live a long life so long as he never knows himself, which is a little play on the know thyself. And I mean, this is the thing when I see these kind of ways that the wisdom is held in story form, and there's so many places you could stop along that journey of how Tiresias got to be the blind seer. And to me, there's so many places along that track that you could just sort of hang out. What is it about those two snakes? And as you said, what is it about knowing two ways of seeing the world? And that's very hermetic, seeing it from the feminine openness to multiple things, and the masculine conical sort of vision of the Cyclops that just can focus on the one thing, and how those two ways is like those two snakes. And then how do we, I guess that's kind of part of, again, why astrology is such a great example of this, is that it's a symbolic language, and yet it's a mathematical language too. There's all this mathematics that goes on behind it. Of course, our computers do that these days. I'm sure you were operating your practice in a time when you had to draw it all up by hand, right, for many, many years.
Oh, originally.
Yeah.
I'm glad I don't have to do that anymore.
Yeah, my God.
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, like
some things that computers are good for.
Yeah, exactly. I agree. But yeah, it's got its mathematical and it's symbolic, kind of all within the same language. So I enjoy that it actually requires of us this art form or science or whatever we want to call it. It requires of us that we develop both sides, because there's no other way to do astrology. I think you have to be working with both, at least on some level.
Yeah. Well, actually, I'll just mention here that before this book that I sent to you, I actually took I wouldn't call it a detour, but it was a journey that lasted probably 7 years or so, in which I wrote 2 books about the archetypal power of numbers as they appear in the birth chart. Not in terms of how we usually think about mathematics, but in the Pythagorean sense of numbers, where they had a spiritual significance as representative of primal forces at work in creating what we call reality. And of course, all of that has been lost. I mean, Pythagoras was a very interesting character, because he I think he did have that sight. He had one foot in both worlds, you know. He can be considered the father of, you know, modern mathematics. I mean, it all came from him originally. But he also knew the deeper spiritual significance of numbers, which he actually was actually a practice. You know, it was part of that. He had a mystery school, you know, and it was an oral tradition. And of course, as what happened with most oral traditions, when it was written down, it became something else. You know, but he had one of his students, Iamblichus, who was also a part of this magical tradition of Neoplatonism, was also one of Pythagoras's primary students of this spirituality of numbers, and he was actually the one that wrote down most of Pythagoras' teachings, and also embellished them with his own ideas, and we wove a bunch of other stuff into it. But it finally wound up being this pithy little book of about, I don't know, 100, 150 pages that was translated in 1988 by Robert Waterfield, called The Theology of Arithmetic.
Wow.
And so I use this as the basis for my sort of, some people would say, wild journey into a possibility of numbers and how they could be read in the birth chart, you know, because they're hardwired in there all sorts of ways, you know. First of all, the Pythagoreans assigned certain numbers to certain gods and goddesses within the tradition.
Wow.
And some of them, and all of these, now that we bring asteroids into our work, I mean, to some extent, some of us do, but a lot of the numbers were ascribed to different asteroids, but really to the gods or goddesses or Greek entities that were, you know, the names for these, the actual beings behind these asteroids. So there's a lot of mythology woven into these numbers right from the get-go, you know, before you even get to, you know, the kind of mathematics that we think about when we think about calculating a chart. And then you have the sidereal periods of the planets. They all, you know, they all can be mapped to whole numbers. And you know, if you have let's say if you have an aspect between Jupiter and Mars, you know, you have a 12-year cycle and a 2-year cycle. So if you have an aspect between Jupiter and Mars in your chart, that points to the number 6, which has its own set of connotations based on these other ideas. And, you know, I go on from there, but anyway, again, I don't think I think the numbers, the numerical dimension of astrology is at least as mythological as it is mathematical.
Yeah.
That whole dimension has been lost.
Right, the qualitative element of numbers. Marie-Louise von Franz talks about that in terms of the Chinese tradition still being much more rooted in the qualitative components, which is, you know, the I Ching and different elements that are in the quality of the number rather than the quantity. She tells a great story about that, where there's these 11 soldiers. They're trying to decide, I'll paraphrase it a little, they're trying to decide whether they go into battle or not. They cast votes, and 3 say retreat and 8 say go into battle, so they retreat. And the reason for that is that the number 3 has the meaning of unanimity. So the fact that 3 aligned with retreat was like, oh, it's unanimous, we should retreat, which goes in the face of like modern Western ways of understanding, because like, no, there's an 8, that's a majority, and it's like, no, the number 3 is unanimous, so it's unanimous, and all the soldiers sort of agree, oh yeah, it's the number 3, so we pull back. As an example of that qualitative component, as a nice little kind of nice little story to me that always wrap that up in a sense. Or encapsulated the idea of qualitative versus quantitative numbers.
Yeah, and the number 8 in the Pythagorean system was associated with the myth of Cadmus, and
Okay.
the foundation of Thebes, which was a
Wow.
really bloody affair, that
Yeah.
involved
Right.
killing of a snake. And
Yeah.
anyway,
Okay. Wow.
so
So definitely don't go with the eight.
there's a whole, yeah, right. It's not going to end well.
It's not going to end well. So wise. There's wisdom there. Amazing. I feel like I could talk to you for another few hours, Joe, but I feel like we better start making our way at least in the direction of the completion of this chat, although I'd love to have you on again.
Sure.
But I wonder if
Sure.
there's anything more that you'd like to, I just want to open up to you if you want to say a bit more about the book and anything else you want to add of the book and your work and where it's at. I just want to open the door for you there to speak on that.
Yeah, just a little bit about the book. The first part of the book is a history of the coevolution of astrology and science, and making the point essentially that, even though most astrologers don't consider themselves to be scientists, so that astrology was shaped by the scientific mindset at each step of the way, and that we've lost a bit because of that compromise, to allow science to have a more active place at the table where we talked about what is reality.
Mm.
In the second part of the book, I talk about how, I talk a little bit about my approach to astrology, which I call Astropoetics, which is the idea that astrology is really a more poetic language, in the sense that, poetry, the best use of poetry is to talk about those things, those dimensions of reality that are not easily put into words.
Mm.
And so I think using that as a metaphor, it allows us to extend the astrological language into, talking about what is reality. Again, from this clear-minded, open-hearted place of alignment,
Mm.
There's a certain humility that has to be present, willingness to create that sacred space we talked. But it is the possible. And then in the last part of the book, I demonstrate how I work with that in relation to the asteroid Vesta, the goddess Vesta, who I come to realize is not just an archetype or a set of ideas, but a actual presence in my life. An intelligence that I can have a relationship to, a more conscious, intentional relationship to. So,
yeah, and as we've been having this conversation in the background of Joe's screen, which nobody can see, there's the symbol of Vesta in the background. So I wonder, before we do wrap up, I'd love to open up to what, my audience may never have heard of Vesta, Hestia in the Greek, and an asteroid, and maybe because it ends up being such a big component of the book, you go into your own experience of this. I don't know what to call it. If it's not a symbol, it's not an archetype. It's, well, as you said, it's a living, breathing reality. Can you give us a glimpse into what your own personal relationship with this, I guess, being, and how that? Yeah.
I mean, there's it's quite an elaborate story, but I'll tell you how it started. In that, Hestia in the Greek and also Vesta in the Roman was the keeper of the sacred flame. And the sacred flame was understood to be not just she was the tender of the hearth, the first layer of it, the fire that kept the home warm in winter, let's say, and that where food was cooked over the fire. It's a sort of the center of the home, but it was also understood to be the center of the nation state, which is what it became in Rome, and also on a deeper level, the center of the cosmos itself. This is the eternal flame that animates this entire panorama we call reality. It's the heart of everything, which is one reason why Hestia was the one goddess in the Greek tradition that had an altar in every temple. Every temple to every other deity in the Greek pantheon had an altar to Hestia, where the sacred fire was kept lit. So, and she was one of the most nondescriptive of the deities. She didn't participate in the Olympian melodramas. She was very, very rarely depicted by the people that painted and drew and wrote poems and made pans to the gods and goddesses. Hestia got short end of the stick there, but I think that was by preference. So anyway, that's just a little background for people that might not know about her. But I started tuning into Hestia around this time of year, and I live in a cabin in the woods as part of a 1,000-acre land cooperative that borders the Ozark Scenic Riverways, which is a natural, wild, protected river corridor. So I live in a forest, and I heat with wood. And I one day I was just tending the fire in my wood stove, realizing I am the keeper of the sacred flame. This is my version of it, and then it extended from there to understanding that, okay, I also cut my own firewood. It's a ritual that I go through every year, and in cutting my firewood, I connect on a deeper level to the forest. I'm a steward of this land. So I'm tending the sacred flame of the temple in which the fire is lit. It extends to that awareness that okay, there's more to it than that. And also, then I started. I just started, when I was reading the book, I started, looking at, okay, well, where else does this Hestia show up? It's not just about the Greek myths. I mean, she's present in many cultures. For example, she's often associated with the goddess Hestia. I mean, not Hestia, Bridget in the Celtic tradition, who was also the keeper of the sacred flame. And she was also the tender of the hearth, but also the tender of the forge. Anyway, I just started becoming aware of all the ways in which Hestia, just another little piece of synchronicity. As I was looking into Bridget, this friend of mine invited me to go out of the blue, seemingly out of the blue, to go on a trip with him and his partner to Glastonbury, England, which is a place that is historically associated with Bridget and Saint Bridget in the Christian, but before that, Bridget in the Celtic tradition. So all of these things started evolving that were Hestia related, and all of a sudden I just started feeling her everywhere. Working at the creative forge was, doing what I consider to be my sacred work, the writing of these books and the study of astrology. And Bridget, was also the goddess of poetry, which is a kind of working with the sacred fire, giving form and shape to it through words. It's a creative energy, the magical sense of words. You speak it and it shall be true. So there's all these dimensions of Hestia as a presence in my life, informing my life in various ways. It's a journey of discovery, was for me. And so that's what I outline in the latter part of the book.
Wow. Yeah, just taking that in. And I kind of love that she doesn't have much mythology except that she is the firstborn, right? She's the firstborn of the Olympians, of Cronus and Rhea. And yeah, there's a lot that you're taking us into, and I can sort of feel the warmth of that fire also just within the individual system, right? But I can feel as you're speaking to it and about it, the warmth kind of building in my own center, because of it's at the center of everything, right? Including the center of the human being. And maybe that's kind of a nice place to find our way out of our little ritual, because in the era of uncertainty, that Hestia is something that we can come back to, the fire in the hearth, the fire in the heart.
Yes.
That sense of like that we all do have the eternal flame within us, not to get too kind of
Yes.
over the top with the language on that. But I do think it's important that we feel that, because it can be an emptying out. I've felt like the element of this nihilistic kind of worldview just sweeping over and sucking everything into a sort of a darkness, like a black hole. And sometimes I need an image, just a simple image without much mythology behind it, And I think Hestia or Vesta kind of gives some of that. Yeah.
I want to leave you with this image. I don't know if you heard about this, but scientists have just discovered this phenomenon. They've known about flares coming out of black holes, but they've discovered this giant flare they call Porphyrion, I think is the word, named after one of the giants in Greek mythology. It was a flare that came out of this black hole that was 140 Milky Ways long.
Whoa.
That's how huge this thing was.
Whoa.
And they're realizing that they're starting to think that, okay, this is this flare that comes out of this black hole had something to do with the creation of the universe.
Huh.
And this goes back, this light that they're seeing goes back 23 million light years.
Oh my God.
So it's very close to the beginning of the creation of the universe.
Huh.
So I can see Hestia there. This is the sacred flame, birth to the entire cosmos.
Wow. I love that.
I mean,
yeah, I love that. 140 Milky Ways. So that's a great image, so that some kind of a thing is occurring. The spirit is still very much alive, even in the darkest of black holes. And I think that's a great way that might be a great image to sort of take us out. Take us out of our conversation today and our space.
Just one more thing is that this is actually where I end the book, because I'm talking about how I didn't consciously understand that Hestia was a perfect guide to this journey of navigating uncertainty. But in the end, it comes down to, yes, if you have a relationship with this sacred flame inside of you, your knowing, your connection to all the rest of this can come from there. It comes down to something simple, but you have to tend the sacred flame. It doesn't just happen.
It's again practice. An active participation in keeping that flame burning. Yeah.
Absolutely.
And a beautiful way to wrap up, kind of like to put a thread into everything we've talked about today, perhaps. So it's nice to feel that sort of come through, and for that to also be the end of your book. Yeah, the simplicity of that, the felt sense of that, what it takes to tend to that, what kind of practices help you tend to that, especially in a time that feels a bit like, about a year ago, I went back and watched The Never-Ending Story to watch the sense of the nothing that was sweeping the land. The antagonist in The Never-Ending Story, at least in the movie, was a great nothing sweeping over everything. And that can be the flavor at the moment when things become less and less real and less authentic, less and less, I can't feel so much from the things that I'm bombarded with, but I can feel deep inside of my own soul and deep inside the soul of the earth and deep inside the soul of the sun, which also is giving out those Hestia-like solar flares, and then ultimately deep inside the very origin of the universe. And of course, Hestia is an origin in that she's an original goddess, and she's firstborn of the Olympians, stays virginal in that she wants to remain removed, but very much at the center. Which is a beautiful, set of images.
And Hestia spent a lot of time in the dark hole. She was the first of Cronus's children to be swallowed, and the last
to come out. Yeah, so she's the one that was down there the longest. Yeah, that's a really good point as well. Maybe because she had so much gestation in the mother and the father, she didn't need to. She was fully formed. Didn't need to get into all the splitting off routines that the rest of the gods and goddesses get into.
Yeah.
Well, thanks, Joe. Well, we intended to head off and find some unexpected things, and I think that's exactly what we did today. And I've really enjoyed it, and really enjoyed meeting you, and I'd love to stay in touch as well.
Yes, let's do that.
Yeah, and down the track, have you on again when the next moment arises, if you're up for that.
I'd be happy to. That'd be great.
Just tell my audience where they can, because obviously a lot of people right now are ready to Google it up and find a way to get your book. How do they find it? How do they find you?
joelandwehr.com. You can go to my website.
Yeah.
And all my books are available there.
Okay, great.
Consultations, classes.
Amazing. Great. And I'll just spell your last name for people, Landwehr. And that's your one-stop shop. You can get everything you need from Joe over there. Wonderful. Thanks, Joe. Thanks for joining me. And
thank you.
Yeah, and thank you for bringing Hestia in to close us out right back at the beginning.
Sure. All right. Well, you take care. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to On the Soul's Terms podcast. To support the show, please consider leaving a 5-star review, sharing with friends, or becoming a patron at patreon.com/onthesoulsterms. Until next time.